Well, we're on the homeward stretch now. I sense a feeling of palpable relief coming to me across the room. I think this last session is going to be a slightly odds and ends offering. What I'm going to try to do is to offer some sort of summary of what it seems to me were the salient characteristics of Scottish late medieval church architecture. And it has to be said that I can only pick out certain aspects that seem to be particularly significant to me, and you may well feel that I'm leaving out things that are important to you. I've been warned by Alan that this is supposed to be a shorter lecture than the others, and I get the impression that he's got a supply of half bricks underneath his seat that he's more than willing to start lobbing at me. Having said that, though, I'm also conscious of the fact that if I go on for a long time, there's going to be no chance for questions and no chance for a vote of thanks from Eric. So I think I don't expect this lecture to be more than about an hour and a half long. Well, I've only changed the title of this last one a little bit. I've put in Pulling Together the Threads, the Scottish Architectural Synthesis. I wish I could say synthesis more easily, but never mind. I'm doing my best. And what I want to do is to, as I say, identify some of the architectural characteristics that do particularly present themselves as worth considering with late medieval architecture. But the first thing that we really have to remember, of course, is that a considerable majority of Scottish late medieval churches were never more than unarticulated rectangular buildings. This was certainly true of a very high proportion of our parish churches. It was also true of quite a number of our churches of middling scale, including quite a lot of collegiate churches. And in fact, I put up here two examples of these rectangular collegiate churches. Falzeaster, which was a foundation of Andrew Lord Grey in 1452, and Innerpeffray Collegiate Church, which was a foundation of John Lord Drummond, probably around 1506. There was a church here from at least the 14th century, and parts of it may be incorporated, and there are also later works. It's quite difficult to work out just what exactly we're looking at it in Innerpeffray. But Falzeaster does seem to be a fairly unified building, putting aside some of the changes that were made in the restorations in the 19th century. But I think Falzeaster is a particularly fascinating illustration of what I suppose you could almost call the pragmatism in the design of these churches, because there's no interest whatever in producing a symmetrical form to the building, and the fenestration and the provision of doors was set out really as was most convenient. So what we find at Falzeaster is that the east wall is almost completely blank, apart from this rather unusual little circular window there, which has now cast iron tracery, which I have doubts if it's original. And of course, the reason that you started having blank walls at the east end of churches was because altar retables were becoming very much more complex, and you needed to have a blank wall against which you set them. But this was compensated for increasingly by having large windows to the south side of the high altar, and here at Falzeaster it's a particularly imposing window on the south side of the altar with intersecting tracery. Then you have the priest's door into the choir, and then you have a very interesting arrangement of windows here, which in fact you can find reflected at a number of other churches as well. Here you have one relatively large window, which would have lit the choir stalls of the clergy who served the college. And then you have this really quite intriguing arrangement of two windows, one above the other. And we know of several other churches where this was the case. And in fact, it was also the case here at Innerpeffray. You can see there's a low window there, and you might just be able to work out that there are the traces of an upper window just there. And that, of course, marks where the screen was that divided the choir from the nave. And the lower window lit the area in front of the screen where there would have been one or more altars, and the upper window lit the area of the rood loft, which at Fowl's Easter, as I'll show you in a second, was particularly important. Then in the nave, you only have this one window on this side here, although you do have a large west window, which you can't see. But of course in the nave you didn't need so much light, because not many people would be reading. Probably the only people who would be reading would be Lord Grey and his wife, who'd be sitting in the chancel anyway, and if they were praying from their books of hours, they were probably the only ones, I say, who could read. There would be plenty of light for them from these windows. But then you've got two other doors, one here and one on the other side of the church, and this clearly was the main entrance for layfolk into the church, and it's the most elaborated of the doors. So the functions, I suppose in Corbusian terms, you really are getting form following function fairly closely in here, and as I say, no interest being shown in any sort of symmetrical arrangement. You had the windows and the doors where it was most convenient. But the real beauty of Fowl's Easter, which I'm sure you all know, is the extraordinary survival of its liturgical furnishings. It has the most amazing set of survivals. It's amazing that they have survived. I suspect actually probably the quality of them wasn't outstandingly high. It's the very fact that they've survived that's most important, and of course the fact that many other churches would have had very, very similar furnishings indeed. Most extraordinary of all, of course, is the remains of the altar retable, which has Christ at the top, the Salvator Mundi. Most of the body has been scrubbed out. And then in the predella area, the area below the main body of the retable, you have a Virgin of Pity holding the dead Christ on her lap. And there are various other saints, I'll not go into them, but that's extraordinary that the altar should have survived. And of course we can consider it, along with the Trinity altarpiece, as a rare survival of a painted altarpiece in Scotland. We also have a wonderful sacrament house, one of the very best of the sacrament houses that we have. This is where the consecrated host was reserved in the church, and it has very fine micro-architectural detailing, miniature buttresses to either side, Christ as Salvator Mundi over the arch, and to either side angels holding two of the instruments of the Passion, the cross and the flagellation post. Then we also have quite a lot surviving from the screen. We have the doors from the screen, which are reset into a modern draft screen. These really are essentially a simplified version of the doors that exist at King's College in Aberdeen. We have this series of saints, which presumably either came from the dado of the screen or from the parapet of the rood loft. But most extraordinary of all, we still have the crucifixion painting surviving. And this really is an absolutely wonderful piece. You can see it's just happening, it's depicted at the very moment that the soldier is piercing Christ's side, and the blood and the water is flowing out. And you'll see that his eyes have been opened, because of course the legend was that he'd been blind, and realizing that this was the Son of God, opened up his eyes. I'll not go through all of the iconography, but there's a lot going on here that's of interest. There's the wicked thief, with his soul being carried away by a devil, and it is a very wicked soul indeed, as you can see. And then on the other side, you have the good thief, with a really quite angelic soul being carried away by an angel. So that's an extraordinary survival. I'm sure you all know it. But it does tell us quite a lot about the church itself, because you can see where it's unpainted just there, that curved line. That gives you the indication of what the roof was like, and it was obviously a curved profile, rather like the one that we had a look at in King's College Chapel. So, there's an awful lot of information from these. And then, of course, we also have the font surviving. It was used as a horse trough, I seem to remember, at one stage, but eventually brought back into the church. And it has scenes from the life of Christ, concentrating particularly on the Passion. And I do love this scene in particular. This is the harrowing of hell, of Christ going down into hell to open up the prospect of salvation for those who I suppose technically were in limbo. But it has really the most endearing jaws of hell that you could ever hope to come across. It's the mouth of a dragon opening wide, and it really is quite delightful. But as I said in the last talk, if you want to learn more about these, do get your copy of Stephen Holmes's edition of David McRoberts' Rhind lectures on church furnishings, Lost Interiors, and you'll find pictures and discussion of all of these. So what I'm saying there, of course, is that these churches look very simple on the outside, but you've got to remember that by the later Middle Ages, furnishings, ecclesiastical furnishings, were probably just as important as the buildings themselves. And actually, often, they must have been quite a lot more expensive than the buildings themselves. Another thing that I think I'd quite like to highlight, I've already talked about the lack of symmetry in the design of churches like Fowles Easter, but you see that on a larger scale in quite a lot of other buildings as well. This cost me an awful effort. I've turned the plan of this church around so that north is to the bottom here, and I was always brought up to believe that you'll rot in hell if you turn church plans round so that north isn't to the top. But I wanted you to be able to see that this transeptal projection here relates to this one here. And we do have an awful lot, well, not an awful lot, but we do have quite a few churches where you have this lopsided enlargement of a church. This is probably the most extreme example of it at Jedburgh. It replaces a very much smaller transept, which that's the footings of the south transept there. So you have to imagine something really rather similar just here coming out there. So it is a considerable enlargement. But they didn't want to do it on the other side because, of course, it would have impinged on the buildings around the cloister. What was the function of these asymmetrical extensions? Well, I think there were probably two main functions. One, to provide additional space for altars, and also to provide burial places as well. And the fact that they were for altars is shown up really rather well by the way in which you only have windows on the west side and in the gable wall. And the east side, against which the altars would have been set, is completely blank masonry. And of course, that's what the altar reticles would have been set against. And we can see that it was used for burials because there is a tomb recess under this window. That's the base of the window just there. So that's the tomb recess. And very often you do find a whole series of examples of these gable walls with a tomb recess set below a window. Here, in fact, you'll see that the tomb has actually been taken over in the 17th century by a member of the Kerr family who took over this transept as their burial place, which is why the main body of it up to there, just there, survives, this part here, still survives with its roof. You see something quite similar at the Hospitaller Preceptory Church of Torficum in West Lothian. This is a building that isn't as well known as it should be, probably mainly because Historic Scotland doesn't open it as often as it should. But what happened here, very curious, I've already talked about this window, of course, here, but what happened here was that you had this enormous great transept built across the church. And there may not have been a transept here before, because you do have a 12th century arch just there, which was probably the original screen or pulpitum opening into this choir just here. But they set up this really quite extraordinary cross-axis across the church, and it became even more prominent later on when they added rooms above the transepts which flanked the tower and almost submerged the tower. But you end up with this very strong cross-axis, which was stronger than the east-west axis within the church itself. But you'll see that the transepts are asymmetrical. The one that led on to the east conventual range is only about square, whereas the south transept projects, which is this one here, projects rather further. And this is the view inside. That's the 12th century arch there that I told you about, but you might just be able to work out that beneath this window there is a tomb recess, rather like the tomb recess that we saw at Jedburgh. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other ways in which symmetry was simply not a consideration at all. We've seen Corstorphing once or twice for a variety of reasons, but here you can see how the aisle that was provided for Sir Adam Forrester in the very early years of the 15th century just simply projects lopsidedly to one side of the building, with no sense that this was in any way inappropriate. But of course, this is taken to absolute extremes in the collegiate church, eventual collegiate church of Edinburgh St Giles, where there was just absolutely no attempt to get any sort of even balance between the different parts of the building externally. There may be reasons for this, of course. Do remember that Edinburgh was built on a very narrow ridge running down from the castle to Holyrood. It was very tightly built up. And in fact, you probably couldn't get many side views of the church. So, you probably never really get a view of the whole of this at any one time. So it didn't matter so much that it was designed in this rather piecemeal way. But the interesting thing is that although the additions were very piecemeal, when you look inside, you see that in fact there was a consistent attempt over more than a century to get the architectural details of all of these additions more or less uniform. So a design that was put together for the arcades in this chapel here, the so-called Albany aisle, was in fact continued in the eastward extension of the presbytery. I'll not go through all of the different additions to the church, but the basic design of the arcades that was established here was followed through throughout the building. So obviously getting things in harmony internally was more important than it was externally. Well, window tracery. I'm afraid I get a bit obsessive about window tracery because it is actually one of the best ways of getting a handle on the date and the cultural context of buildings. I've shown you various types of window tracery. We've looked at some churches that have English rectilinear tracery. We've looked at some churches that have that sort of Netherlandish-inspired loop tracery of different kinds. But there were certain types of tracery that were probably favoured more than any others, and that you can find used over and over again over a really quite extended period of time. You see two of them here at Linlithgow St Michael, where you can have your mouchettes pointing inwards with a quatrefoil at the top, or if you really wanted to be daring, you could have your mouchettes pointing outwards with the quatrefoil at the top. These two were very, very common types. Another very common type was one where you had a circlet with spiralling mouchettes or daggers in the head. That's also a very common type in the Netherlands. Whether there was any connection there or not, I wouldn't like to say. I think I've pushed my luck far enough in trying to draw connections with the Netherlands. And of course, there was also a continuing interest in reticulated tracery in a lot of churches. And you may remember yesterday I was saying that's the sort of tracery that if you looked at it in England, you'd expect it to be about the 1320s, and that's when the reticulation in the west window of the refectory at Dunfermline was. But here in Scotland, you find it remaining in favour pretty much throughout the Middle Ages. And then, of course, you could have the permutations on these themes, where, here at Haddington, you have the pair of sub-arches with the two inward-facing daggers, and, well, it's not a quatrefoil here, it's a dagger form, and it's doubled up with more dagger forms within the centre of the field. You could do exactly the same, of course, with spiraling dagger tracery, like here at Dundee St Mary, where there are the windows subdivided by these sub-arches that I was talking about earlier. Each of them has the sort of motif that we've seen in other windows doubled up, and then just with other forms in the window head. This is another example of the sort of permutation that you can have with the outward-facing daggers and the quatrefoil at the head. And you will find these over and over again, so you've got to be very, very cautious indeed in using them for dating evidence, unless you've got other evidence that you can rely on. Well, I've talked about barrel vaulting quite a lot, and I touched on what the aesthetic consequences of the use of barrel vaulting was. Just to give a slightly festive note in this one, I've actually allowed the wedding to appear in the photograph. The bride was somewhere behind me glowering, but she wasn't able to get down just yet. With this, you'll remember the Carmelite church at South Queensferry, founded by the Dundas family in 1440 and restored by Bishop John Dowden around about 1900. But here you see something of what the aesthetic consequences were, where really a good half of the height of the building is within the area of the barrel vault. One thing that intrigues me, and intrigues lots of other people as well, is these corbels that go along at the head of the vertical section of the wall. I don't think they were designed for electric lights, first of all, but they do serve that purpose extremely well. What they were for, I don't. If you saw them in a castle, you'd think it was for a mezzanine or entresol floor. You're obviously not going to have a floor in the choir here, and I do just wonder if, in fact, they may have been intended to support ribs decorating the surface of the vault. You might remember that I showed you examples of where ribs have fallen away and left very little trace. So it is at least a possibility that there were ribs there like that. But you remember I said amongst the consequences, although you could have large windows in the gable walls, in the side walls you had to keep the windows very low indeed. So it did give this feeling, which I actually find extremely attractive, that somehow the church is hewn out of the rock. But of course that would have been less so when the walls were plastered, and there would have been probably quite rich painted decoration on the plaster as well. This is really something you always have to supply in your imagination. But these are examples of churches with different types of ribs to the pointed barrel vault. This is Ladykirk down in Berwickshire, an absolutely lovely church. It's a royal foundation by James IV, apparently after he'd been rescued from drowning in the Tweed. And we know that the master mason was Nicholas Jackson, and the main brunt of the building was carried out between about 1500 and 1507. I'll show you a little bit more of this church later on, because it is a very interesting example. But this does show you very nicely, I think, how all the openings had to be really in the lower half of the walls if you weren't going to impinge on the vault and reduce its structural viability. Here you'll see the wedding has already finished, so I did at least wait until that was over. But then, of course, there was also the option of having the ribs set out on the pattern of four-part or quadrupart vaulting as well. And we do have a lot of churches of modest scale with this sort of vaulting in them, and as a group they are very attractive. Something about apses, we've already talked about it quite a lot. I think, I may be wrong, but I think it was probably Bishop James Kennedy who introduced the idea of the aisleless chapel with an apsidal east end here at St Salvator's. He was somebody who was very well placed to introduce this idea, but it was something that really caught on like wildfire in Scotland. There were apses in England in a number of buildings, places like Lichfield Cathedral, of course. The Lady Chapel was apsidal, but there aren't the similarities with the English buildings that you find with some of the French buildings for the earliest of our Scottish examples. But you see the idea beginning to be disseminated at Crossraguel Abbey. We know from, or at least we're told by Father Richard Augustine Hay, that this was, the materials for this were gathered by Abbot Colin Kennedy, 1460 to 1490 he was abbot, and it won't have escaped you, of course, that we have two Kennedys involved here, and they were almost certainly kinsmen, and I do think it's very likely indeed that it was in looking at his kinsman's chapel at St Salvator that gave the idea to Colin Kennedy for Crossraguel. If anybody knows, said he, looking to see if Michael's still there at the back, if there was a connection between, a close connection between these two Kennedys, I'd be very pleased to hear. But then the idea was taken on in all sorts of churches, a lot of them now lost. It looks, for example, as if Kirkfield in Edinburgh had an apsidal east end. Excavations at the Dominican Church in Stirling seem to have found the evidence of an apsidal east end. One was found at Curras, the Church of St Kentigern, which was founded by Archbishop Blackadder of Glasgow as part of his attempt to bring new enthusiasm into the cult of St Kentigern, because this is thought to be where St Thenu was cast ashore after she was cast adrift in the Forth by her father, who was apparently rather less than chuffed that she was about to have a baby. And this is where she's supposed to have given birth to St Kentigern. We have quite a lot of apses still surviving, but let's remember places like Hamilton had them. The Hospital Chapel of St Nicholas in Glasgow. Here it's depicted as being curved. but I think it's almost certain that it was polygonal, but a whole series of others. It was an idea that really had found its time in Scotland. And of course, we've seen at Trinity College, this is where I think the idea of the apse was introduced to aisled buildings, in in a sense, the chapel that was founded for prayers to be offered for James II. But it was followed in quite a lot of other buildings as well. But I have to say, most other master masons seem to have had real difficulty in fitting these apses onto aisled buildings. It can be rather endearing seeing how they did it, but here at Stirling Holyrood, which is a very sophisticated piece of architecture in many ways, they've got the apse rather wider than the central vessel of the choir, which was giving them problems to start with. And then instead of having a ribbed vault over it in the way that you had at Trinity College, what they did was first of all to throw across these two arches on each side, which narrowed the width of the apse, and then they put this pointed barrel vault over it. And if ever there was a space that wasn't designed for a pointed barrel vault, this really probably is it. But there does seem to have been this feeling in the later Middle Ages in Scotland that if you got a problem, it would always be solved if you put a pointed barrel vault over it, and it just didn't always work. The best case of that is the octagonal superstructure of the chapter house at Inchcombe Abbey, where a pointed barrel vault was put over it. And if ever there was an example of the triumph of hope over experience, my word, that was it. And you see similar problems in the crypt apse at St Nicholas in Aberdeen. The main apse itself, of course, had a timber ceiling, which wasn't so much of a problem. The date of this apse is very difficult. They seem to have been starting work on the crypt below the east end by 1449, but I don't think the apse can have been part of it. And in fact, the ribs of the apse are rather different. But just look at the difficulties that they've had in vaulting this lower chapel. They've had to cut down through these capitals, and you can see they have actually cut down through them to get the ribs down there, and they've rammed in a corbel to support it. And you can almost feel the sense of despair that was in their hearts when they tried to work out just how that springing was going to work out just there. So, we do have these vaulted aisled apses, but they don't always work quite as well as they did at Trinity. Something else that we'd get quite a few of in Scotland is laterally projecting apses. And two of the nicest examples are at Ladykirk, where you have the east apse, and you also have the lateral apses. This incidentally illustrates rather nicely how the windows have to be low down in the walls to allow the vaulting, because the vaulting springs from about this point here and then goes up beneath those stone flags. But this is the church, you'll remember, that I said was built for James IV, presumably in thanksgiving for his rescue from drowning in the Tweed. But this arrangement of the symmetrical apses is very attractive indeed. And of course, let's remember that this is a phase when quite a lot of churches across Europe were being built with these lateral apses. Windsor Castle has them really by the bucket load. The transepts themselves are apsidal, and then you have these chapels at either end, which are as well. And then on a small scale, you can look to Holland, something like St Bommel Church, which probably dates from the later 15th century. Lots of other examples there as well. And probably the scale of the chapels that we have at Ladykirk is closer to that, but I don't think I dare push the Netherlandish debts too far just at the moment. I've rammed quite a few down your throat, so let's leave them at that. But there were then a number of other lateral chapels, and probably more than survive. Gosh, really, I'm going to have to hurry up. I've already shown you St Andrew's Dominican Church as an example. This is the view by Geddy of about 1580, showing the, you see, Dominicanorum Ides. But you'll see that on the south side, although there seems to be a transept, it looks as if it had a straight gable, and it was just a single apsidal chapel on the north side. But the most splendid of all of them is the apsidal chapel that was built at Arbuthnot in Kincardineshire. Well, it looks pretty certainly as if it was about 1505. It was built for Robert Arbuthnot and his wife Mariota Scrimger. So it was a limited fashion, but it's something that we do find examples of. Well, just a very quick whistle-stop tour through some of the rural collegiate churches, because I think probably the two groups of buildings in which we can really get the spirit of Scottish late Gothic architecture better than anywhere else are the collegiate churches and the great borough churches. This is just a montage of a number of collegiate churches over a period of time, varying from Tain, which I think probably dates to about 1390. It's very much in the same sort of group of buildings that we were looking at Fortrose and the rebuilding at Elgin. And there were endowments, admittedly only investments in 1390, but I think it could perhaps be tied in with rebuilding. We have cruciform churches at Dunglass and Crichton. Crichton is one of those examples where the original part of the building has now been lost. This is something that we find quite often. These collegiate buildings were very often additions to existing parish churches, which more often than not were rectangular buildings. But after the Reformation, it was the collegiate parts, which were architecturally much more splendid, that were kept, and the original parts of the building were allowed to fall down. And I think that's what happened here. And then, of course, Roslin in 1450, the most complex of all of the rural collegiate churches. But it's when you look at the plans of these, this is a series of plans that I tried to draw out to the same scale some years ago. Just look at the amount of variety that there is in the ways that collegiate churches could be housed. I've already said that for me, the finest of them is Seton Collegiate Church. And I think it illustrates probably rather better than any other just how these collegiate churches took shape. The church started off, certainly by the 13th century, as a simple rectangular building, just here. And then at a later stage, a chapel was added by, gosh, I can never remember whether it was Lady Janet or Lady Catherine. I do get my Janets and Catherines mixed up at Seton. But what essentially was a chantry aisle was added on the south side of the church for the family. But then the family rose in status, and the first of the Setons, who was called to Parliament as a parliamentary lord, the first Lord Seton, started building what he intended to be a collegiate church. Unfortunately, the collegiate foundation wasn't finalised for quite some years, but he started by building this collegiate choir onto the east end of the church, and it was just simply attached to the east end of this rectangular church. And you might be able to work out that the walls, in fact, must have overlapped the walls of the original building. On this side, of course, there was this chapel here surviving, so that covered the junction there, but inside the church there is still the remains of a buttress just there at the corner, which bridged the junction. And that was finished by the second and the third Lords Seton. But then it was decided to build an asymmetrical transeptal projection on the north side of the church, which partly balanced this chapel just here, but not really completely. And so that was simply projecting on the north side of the nave still. And then in the final phase, possibly around the 1540s, it was decided to take down this chapel and build a transept that mirrored more or less precisely the transept on the other side, and a crossing was formed between them. So what happens is, this is the earliest arch just there, that's the next arch just there, and then those two arches were built together, and you can get the sequence of it from looking at the details. It's always worth really looking at the details of these churches to try and work out what happened. And a tower was built over the new crossing, and that's where the Reformation took place, just there halfway up the spire. But the design of Seton was in fact going to be an inspiration for a whole number of other collegiate churches which followed its ideas quite closely. Dalkeith Collegiate Church, where actually there was a college from round about the mid-15th century, but I don't think this can date from earlier than fresh endowments of about 1503. And then it also had at least one transept on that side. What's happening on the other side is slightly confusing. But probably the most carefully articulated copy of Seton was it bigger down in Lanarkshire, which in fact was the last college to be founded, the last rural college to be founded in Scotland by Lord Fleming in about 1545. And here they've taken pretty much everything lock, stock and barrel from Seton, and in the same way they've attached it to an earlier church on the other side, although the earlier church was revamped in a 19th century restoration so that it now looks as if it's part of the whole building. So Seton does seem to have provided a model for a number of collegiate churches. Well, what about the greater churches? I'm going to have to really race through these. There wasn't so much building at the greater monastic and cathedral churches as perhaps there had been earlier on. And of course it's often said that this was because the major foundations were rather falling out of favour. They were perhaps seen as not fulfilling their original functions as well as they perhaps once had. And there may be an element of truth in this. But I think there's also, it also has to be borne in mind that most of these cathedrals and abbeys were already very well equipped with very handsome buildings indeed. And there probably wasn't an awful lot of point in most cases in going in for major rebuilding, which was going to completely disrupt your life. Having said that, there still was quite a lot of rebuilding. An awful lot of Iona was rebuilt, and of course the Royal Commission and Ian Fisher have produced a masterly analysis of the sequence of building here at Iona. Aberdeen, of course, was totally rebuilt in the later Middle Ages. Dunkeld, the nave, rebuilding was started in about 1406 and continued for about 70 years altogether. And at Paisley, a very complex building. Basically, the nave is the rebuilding started in the 13th century, but it was going to have two west towers. Then there was either a pause or what was built was destroyed. Then in the early years of the 15th century, you'll all remember with absolute perfect precision that John Morrow came in and started rebuilding this part here. And then, of course, Thomas Turbis completed the nave and probably also quite a lot of the transepts. The choir here is a total mystery. It was destroyed very soon after the Reformation, leaving only its foundations, an extraordinarily long choir. And it's very difficult to know its date. The only survivor from the church that might point to dating is sedilia inside the church, which are very like sedilia at St Monan's Church, which might suggest that it was a late 14th century date. But now, as restored in the 19th and 20th centuries, it looks like it's very, very handsome indeed, but it does rather look like the chapel of a particularly expensive public school or Oxbridge College. But we do still have all of the medieval works still surviving there in the nave. The borough churches, of course, we do have much more surviving from this period. And in fact, the later Middle Ages were the great period for the rebuilding of the borough churches. And I was talking about this quite a lot earlier on. These are mainly in the East Coast trading boroughs. And these are the churches that I think do show quite a lot of evidence of contact with the Low Countries. Quite a lot of them have been very, very extensively rebuilt. That's certainly true of Aberdeen, where really now the only medieval work to survive is in the transepts. It's also true of Dundee, where only the tower is medieval. At Edinburgh, of course, the whole of the exterior, apart from the tower and the crown steeple, are part of the restoration by William Byrne, in which he tried to give it a symmetry that it never had, and later restoration there as well. Perth has been very, very heavily restored as well, although there's rather more medieval work surviving. Haddington is probably one of the most completely medieval of the borough churches, although it has been altered very much. And of course, just before the Reformation, the choir was gutted by the English, and it was never restored until the later 20th century, although the basic shell of it was okay. St Andrews, well, it has the look of being a medieval building, but all that is medieval is the tower at the northwest corner, parts of the lower bit of the west front, and one or two arcade piers inside. So, all of these have been very heavily worked over. Having said that, we know quite a lot about their original forms. I've tried to draw out the plans of all of those where the original plan can be rescued. And I think you may be struck by just how much similarity of scale there is between all of these buildings. You almost get the feeling that there was a sense that there was a certain size that was right for these borough churches. An awful lot of them have naves of 5 bays, for example. I'll not go through all of the ways in which you can compare them, but there are quite a lot of basic similarities in the ways that they were set out. And of course, what they had to accommodate, well, they had to accommodate the high altar in the presbytery, a lot of additional altars as well, quite a lot of chaplainries that were founded within them. They, of course, served communities of lay folk. They might have pilgrimage functions as well. And all of these had to be accommodated within a single building. And let's remember that in most cases, there was just a single parish church in these boroughs. And these were seen as the great focus of civic pride in those boroughs in the days before town halls. When you wanted to show just how fine and important your borough was, it was the parish church that was going to be seen as expressing that best of all. But most of these churches were set out to a relatively homogeneous plan. That certainly isn't the case, of course, at Edinburgh St Giles, but Haddington, mainly Perth, Linlithgow certainly, to a lesser extent Stirling Holyrood, were designed in a way which would accommodate all of these functions within a homogeneous framework. Well, what were they like inside? I'm going to have to be very quick indeed now. Perth St John, I think, may have been an intention in the early 15th century to create a hall church. That's a church in which the central vessel, I think I see Alan getting his pile of half bricks ready for jettisoning, where the central vessel and the aisles were all the same height. And I think what we're seeing is an abortive scheme here for doing that. Most of them were two-storied designs. I've included cathedrals and abbeys in this as well, because I think they can all be brought together. We find quite a lot where we have two-storied elevations with cylindrical piers supporting the arcades. These are more examples, Stirling, Holyrood and Aberdeen. Stirling, rather interestingly though, the easternmost piers of the arcade are rather more complex, perhaps marking the division between the nave and the choir. A whole series of churches, and these three are probably quite closely interrelated, were designed with clustered shaft piers as far as possible. That could only be done at the east end of Edinburgh because it still had the late 14th century octagonal piers for the rest of it. But these two-storey designs, very carefully articulated by wall shafts and a string course that separates the levels. Of course, here at Trinity, again, let me remind you that this wall here between the arcade piers should be thought away in your minds. But I think you'll see that there's considerable similarity between those three churches. And certainly in the cases of Edinburgh St Giles and Edinburgh Trinity, there were links of patronage as well. We did, of course, have a reversion to three-storied designs, which, as I said yesterday, was slightly unexpected. Dunkeld Cathedral and Paisley Abbey are the two most obvious examples. But very, very oddly indeed, there were also at least two parish churches where there was either a three-storied design or an intention to have one. We do still have it at Linlithgow St Michael. Think away this plaster vault over the nave, which is part of the Gillespie Graham restoration. But I'm fairly sure something of the kind was intended at Stirling as well, which is a building on a much larger scale. Looks like a two-storied design, arcade, rather squat clerestory, but go and have a look at the clerestory from the outside, and that clerestory was clearly never, ever meant to be externally visible, and you can actually see the slope of the roof there that would have covered it. That is really a triforium or gallery, and I think that does rather suggest that there had been an intention to build a clerestory on the top of this. That took an awful lot of courage because there was a very steep road leading up to it, and Stirling has shown considerable interest in being further down the hill than it is at the moment. So to have the clear story on top as well really would have been asking a bit much. And we can also see, I haven't brought it, you'll be pleased to know, but there's also evidence in the nave that there was an intention of adding a clear story over it as well. So, this rather curious retardataire interest in three-story elevations is something that we do find. And, it does add an extra dimension of interest to our churches. Alan, you can put your bricks away. So this, I think, ought to be the last slide. Just put up two of my absolute all-time favourite churches, Seton and Linlithgow borough churches. And so, in conclusion, I really do hope that I've been able to convince any waverers amongst you that the architectural consequences of the late medieval process of assimilation and gestation of new ideas represent an enormously rewarding field of study, in which there really is still a great deal that's worth doing. So, if any of you are thinking of going back to university to do PhDs, assuming you can find the money to do it, of course, there is plenty of scope for working on our medieval churches. And I do think that many of our buildings that survive from these centuries are altogether delightful. And I do hope that you'll agree with me that they represent what can be regarded as Scotland's first distinctive approach to architectural design, and that they really do deserve to be celebrated as such. And so I see Alan getting a little bit peevish again, but could I absolutely finally thank you all for being such a loyal and supportive audience. It has made my task very much less harrowing than it might have been, although heaven only knows it has been harrowing, but thank you.